Thank you all for joining us this afternoon. The Gulf of Mexico waters touch the shores of the United States, Mexico, and Cuba. The U.S. portion of the Gulf region extends from the Florida Keys westward to the southern tip of Texas, following for thousands of miles the coastlines of Florida, Alabama, Louisiana, Mississippi, and Texas. The Gulf of Mexico is home to diverse habitats, some unique to the nation and the world. Although best known for its shrimp and crabs, the Gulf's waters are home to over 15,000 species. The Gulf of Mexico region is a vital economic engine for the U.S., supplying trillions of dollars annually to the national economy and providing jobs for millions of people. The Gulf supports major marine industries like seafood, shipping, and oil and gas production. The white sand beaches, the vibrant culture, and the warm weather create numerous recreational opportunities along the Gulf's coasts and a thriving tourism industry. However, degradation of the Gulf of Mexico's water is seriously threatening not only the Gulf's ecosystems, but also the region's livelihood. Harmful algal blooms, toxic dead zones, deterioration of valuable coastal wetlands have put the region's fisheries, tourism, and infrastructure in peril. Much of the water quality issues impacting the Gulf of Mexico are due to nutrients and contaminants carried from inland, with the Mississippi watershed being the primary contributor. The Mississippi River begins in northern Minnesota and flows 2,350 miles to the Gulf of Mexico. The Mississippi watershed drains all or parts of 31 U.S. states between the Appalachian and Rocky Mountains, capturing runoff from 41% of the continental United States. An oversupply of nitrogen, phosphorus, and other nutrients flow through the river into the Gulf to create the Gulf of Mexico dead zone. One cannot discuss the water quality of the Gulf without thinking about the Deepwater Horizon spill. 2 years ago, after that historic event, the recovery is still underway, and research is still being conducted to better understand the full and lasting impact of this man-made disaster. Today, the American Geophysical Union and the American Geosciences Institute are proud to present 3 expert scientists to discuss water quality issues in the Gulf of Mexico and the Mississippi watershed, the causes of water quality degradation, and recommendations for remediation. I would like to thank the American Geosciences Institute for their support in putting together this briefing, and especially thank our speakers here today. So I'd like to introduce our 3 speakers, and I'll start first with Dr. Larry McKinney. Dr. McKinney is the Executive Director of the Harte Research Institute for the Gulf of Mexico Studies at Texas A&M, Corpus Christi, leading an interdisciplinary team that integrates science, policy, and socioeconomic expertise to assure an economically and environmentally sustainable Gulf. Dr. McKinney chairs the Ecosystem Assessment and Integration Team at the Gulf Alliance, the Flower Gardens National Marine Sanctuary Advisory Committee, and the Texas Sea Grant Science Advisory Committee. He is past president of the Texas Academy of Sciences. Dr. McKinney received his doctorate from Texas A&M University in 1976. He is here today to speak about the importance of the Gulf of Mexico to the Gulf region and the nation, and to discuss water quality issues impacting the Gulf east and west of the Mississippi Delta. Next, Dr. Nancy N. Rabelais. Dr. Rabelais is a professor and executive director of the Louisiana University's Marine Consortium at Cocodrie, Louisiana. Her research interests include the dynamics of hypoxic environments, interactions of large rivers with the coastal ocean, estuarine, and coastal eutrophication, and science policy. Dr. Rabelais is currently serving as a member of the National Research Council's Committee on the Effects of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill on ecosystem services in the Gulf of Mexico, and she recently served on 3 other NRC committees on the Mississippi River and the Clean Water Act. She received her PhD in zoology from the University of Texas at Austin in 1983. Dr. Rabelais is here today to speak about the major water quality issues impacting the Gulf of Mexico from the Mississippi River. She will describe inland waterways links to the Gulf and also provide insight on the impact of the Deepwater Horizon oil spill 2 years after the event. And finally, Dr. Carol Kendall. Dr. Kendall has been a research hydrologist at the U.S. Geological Survey since 1980. She received her PhD in geology with an emphasis on geochemistry from the University of Maryland. Since 1990, she has been the head of the USGS Isotope Tracers Research Project in Menlo Park, California. Her main research interests focus on tracing sources of nutrients and organics in large river ecosystems. Dr. Kendall was elected an AGU Fellow in 2010, and for her contributions to isotope hydrology and biogeochemistry. Dr. Kendall will build on Dr. Rabelais' discussion of nutrient flow into the Gulf by providing insight into where these nutrients come from within the Mississippi watershed and possible methods of remediation. So with that, I would like to call our first speaker to the podium, Dr. Larry McKinney.
Thank you very much for that introduction. This is probably your worst nightmare, a speed-talking Texan with a time limit and a topic as big as the Gulf of Mexico. But we'll take a shot at it. My goal is to try to frame this issue for you and talk about the habitat issues related to the Gulf of Mexico and water quality, and then my colleagues here will certainly amplify on that. My first thing I'd like to make the point of is that talking about the Gulf of Mexico, it really is a sea of contrasts, as it states here. It's a place where a healthy economy and a healthy environment both coexist and contend with one another. I mean, many people recognize that the Gulf of Mexico is a highly industrialized sea, but what they don't also think about that it's also a very healthy and productive large marine ecosystem. I want to illustrate those 2 points for you. First of all, the Gulf of Mexico is vital to the energy security of this country. About half of the oil and natural gas reserves are found in the Gulf of Mexico, half of the refining capacity. Many of the largest ports are located here in the Gulf as well, and you can see the pipelines that stretch out from the Gulf around throughout the nation, which is really a blood supply system for the entire country. At the same time, the Gulf of Mexico produces 1.4 billion pounds of seafood every year, and preponderance of shrimp and crabs and oysters. I never fail to note when I'm here in D.C. and eating seafood with some of my compatriots that the Gulf of Mexico, the seafood that you're eating here in the capital, probably about an 80% chance of that seafood came from the Gulf of Mexico rather than the Chesapeake Bay right next door. It doesn't bother me to make that statement a lot, and also make the point that the federal government attention to the Gulf of Mexico is far less than at Chesapeake Bay. But it's not just seafood production, it's recreational fishing. It's a huge industry in the Gulf of Mexico. About half the recreational fishing in this country takes place in the Gulf of Mexico, a $16 billion annual economic benefit for the country. All of this is function and health in the Gulf of Mexico is predicated on the fact that the Gulf of Mexico is a large marine ecosystem that is resilient, and this resiliency is the key to its productivity and health at this point. A lot of that resilience is built on an important connection, the linkage between the Mississippi River as it flows into the Gulf of Mexico and the Gulf Stream flowing up out of the Caribbean. The Gulf is a subtropical area that is bounded by temperate waters and tropical waters, and is a mix of those two. And so when the conditions are highly variable in the Gulf, when we see hurricanes and droughts and floods and all these types of things, the system has elements of each of those so it can adjust very rapidly. So it has evolved a series of very adaptive species that not uncoincidentally are also economically important. Shrimps, crabs, oysters, redfish, those types of things really do well in those situations. All of this is predicated on a diverse and abundant habitat that we see in the Gulf of Mexico and the biodiversity that it supports. But like any rubber band, any resilience, the resilience you see in a rubber band, any rubber band that's stretched over and over and over begins to lose that resilience. And that's the issue that we have a concern here in the Gulf of Mexico, in which my colleagues will be talking more about, is how long can this system maintain that resilience in the face of the challenges that we're facing, and particularly we're talking about Deepwater Horizon, but other challenges as well. That's the key to the future of the Gulf of Mexico. How can we maintain that resilience? Well, it's all based on natural infrastructure, that's habitat. The Gulf of Mexico has about half of the wetlands in the United States, some 90% of seagrasses, 95% of mangroves, and actually 90% of coral reefs, which is not on this slide. But there are challenges faced, and we've already lost half of these wetlands. We've lost up to 40% of our seagrasses, some places even more than that, and the same with mangroves as well. All of this due to activities like channelization, coastal development, and these types of things. These are putting stresses on this system, and of course loss of habitat obviously is going to affect the resilience of the system. Just to illustrate that a bit, when you look at, this is the bird's foot of Louisiana that you see in green there in the upper left-hand corner. That is before Katrina, but after Katrina, almost overnight, we lost 200 square miles of wetland habitat because of relative sea level rise and change, subsidence from oil and gas extraction and groundwater removal and those types of things. That's on top of an annual loss of some 20 to 40 square miles of habitat each year. While we're talking here today, over this length of time, we will probably lose something like a football field size or a football field size and a half of wetlands in Louisiana just in this time frame. So the loss is a tremendous rate, the greatest loss of wetlands that we see anywhere in this country. There are consequences to that habitat loss. One here illustrates some points of it is that these wetlands provide important ecosystem services to all of us. One of those services is flood prevention, and we're seeing increasing numbers of floods not only here in the Gulf but around the world because of this habitat. Specifically, when you look at what happened in Louisiana after Katrina, the places where those dikes failed around New Orleans were the places that were not fronted by natural wetlands. And that had grave consequences, not only in property loss, but clearly in lives. So these habitat provide these important economic services to us, and maintaining them is what's important for us in the future because the challenges are going to increase. And the 800-pound gorilla in the room, the challenges that we're facing, of course, is population growth. Population has been growing in the Gulf since the early 50s, and when you look toward the future, it's going to continue, even accelerate. In this particular graphic, the darkest shade of red means population increases up to 100%. So population growth and everything that comes with it will be an ongoing issue that we're going to deal with in the Gulf of Mexico. Well, I'm going to focus on what I think is the most important issue and resource and degradation around in the Gulf of Mexico, and that is water. And whether it's too little or too much or in the wrong place or the wrong time, water management is the key resource management issue that we have to deal with on both east and west in the Gulf of Mexico and, of course, the Mississippi River itself. And again, my colleagues will talk very much more about the Mississippi, and I'll focus a little bit more on the peripheral edges of it. The first thing I want to talk about is water quantity. We often talk about water quality, but you can't have a river if you don't have water in it, and you can't have an estuary unless water is flowing into it. So that's the key issue, water quantity, that I want to focus on. And it does three things for us in estuaries. These estuaries that we're talking about, of course, these are the most productive areas of the Gulf of Mexico. This is where all the seafood that we produce occurs for the most part. And also it's these estuarine areas that absorb so much of the wastewater products of our cities and our industries, and their health and vitality is what absorbs these insults and keeps the system functioning, producing that seafood and protecting our health. So freshwater inflows do three main things. One is that as these fresh waters move into the estuaries and meet the sea, they create gradients, areas of differing salinity within the estuaries, where different life stages of these shrimps and crabs and so forth must have in order to thrive. They also bring nutrients through the fuel of the system. They keep it going and help supply all of that productivity. And when we have floods, primarily, it also brings sediments into the Gulf of Mexico that builds on these wetlands that are subsiding because of sea level rise and oil and gas and water withdrawal. So they provide a really important function in that regard. The problem is, as it shows here, is that the amount of water in reservoirs has quadrupled since 1960. And there's now 3 to 6 times as much water in reservoirs as there are in natural rivers. And withdrawals from rivers and lakes have doubled since 1960. We're basically draining the coast for many other purposes that we need. For industry and municipality, all that growth, they have to have water. I'm often talk about water in the state of Texas, and when I'm talking about it and looking at projections into the future of how we can meet water demands of a population that in Texas will double in 2050, and that should scare you, twice as many Texans as there are now, any place. But when I talk, I say, we have plenty of water for every Texan. We have plenty of drinking water for every Texan. It's their lawns that we don't have enough water for. And that's what we talk about is the use of water. And this is where we're headed. I'm going to give you a couple of illustrations of how this works. Of course, much water in reservoirs is either for municipal use or flood control. And when you look at this particular graphic, you can see that the blue line represents the more or less natural hydrological cycle of a spring flood and a smaller fall flood that typically happens. And the whole system, the whole Gulf system has evolved to take advantage of these floods and droughts. But when you put the dams into place for water supply or flood control, typically you take a good chunk of that spring flood, and then often for flood control you stretch it out. All of our estuaries need these floods. They bring sediments, they change salinities. In fact, things like oysters depend on these freshwater water coming through systems in pulses to help reduce disease. But they can't take long periods of fresh water. So short floods are good. And you see in this graphic, the fall flood is taken out altogether. So you begin to change the whole dynamics of that ecosystem and begin to affect its ability, its resilience, to be able to absorb punishment when you begin to change the system like that. When you operate reservoirs for hydropower production, as it is here in this Texas example in Sabine Lake, you flip the entire system upside down. Because in Texas, unlike here, we need lots of electrical power to cool things off in the summer, not in the winter. So we reverse things, and we hold water in those reservoirs until the summer, and then release them in large amounts to produce electricity to cool houses and those types of things. So that's what happens, and that's what's going to happen to the system. Water quality, of course, is an issue and a concern that we have to look forward to as well, and I want to talk about that just briefly. The Gulf of, and I'm going to make this very important point, is that the Gulf of Mexico absorbs industrial, agricultural, and wastewater discharges unequal to any other coastal region of the U.S. to provide the food, the goods, and the products foundational to the economic health of this country. The Gulf of Mexico takes huge risks and huge insults to its ecosystem in order to provide the comfort for the rest of the country. And people need to be aware of that. That's what happened. There's a great exchange there, and that's why the health and productivity of the Gulf of Mexico is an important national issue, because we all depend on what happens down there. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on water quality because again, my colleagues are going to expand on it and will do a really good job of illustrating it. I don't want to duplicate that. But just to make a point that we are concerned about the increasing number of advisories and such around the Gulf of Mexico. And so these are issues or indicators of some concern that we have to take. Now I have to, because I live in the Gulf, I have to make this point, or I couldn't go back there tonight or tomorrow. It says, the extensive federal and state testing of Deepwater Horizon impacts on the fish and shellfish continue to prove negative. The seafood in the Gulf of Mexico is safe to eat. I eat it every day. So take that in mind. So I've done my duty there. I want to throw this one illustration up here to make this point. These are a tracing of beach closures over time. And I illustrate this for a couple of points. One is that while they have been increasing, you'll notice that they did peak and begin to drop off, except for that last bar there. That reflects the Deepwater Horizon oil spill, so it's pretty much artificial. But the decline in beach closures and advisories have been decreasing. Why has that happened? Because once people became alarmed that their beaches were being closed and they could not go to them, we funded through state and federal and other actions, even local monies, monitoring programs to begin to check those waters to see how safe they were or not, and we publicized the results. And the way you get public action or get any kind of action on environmental issues is this way, and this is the way. Monitoring programs are extraordinarily valuable to provide that information, and then the public, getting that information out to the public to act on is equally important. We know the consequences of failure. We look around the world. If we don't take care of these ecosystems, you can affect even very large marine ecosystems and other ecosystems by neglect. So we need to learn those lessons and apply them here in the Gulf of Mexico while we still have options. And we do have options. I want to wrap up with that, is that although it seems overwhelming when we look at these big issues, basically there's a whole range of actions that can be taken to address the health and future of the Gulf of Mexico, from the smallest individual actions to the largest. And I'll bring your attention to this. Back in December, we held a summit for the Gulf of Mexico. We brought a large group of leaders from around the Gulf of Mexico together to look towards solutions, and three things came out of that. One is that all the non-governmental conservation organizations grouped together and were able to come to an agreement on what they felt were the highest priorities for restoration in the future of the Gulf of Mexico. At the summit, the Gulf Restoration Task Force announced its plan to use Clean Water Act fine money to deal with restoration issues in the Gulf of Mexico, to lay those out. Then also we looked at a proposal to develop a report card for the Gulf of Mexico to track progress in that direction. So we have tools out there, big tools that will allow us to work on an ecosystem level to begin to address these issues. And that's what really I think is critical, because what we're going to do in the Gulf of Mexico in the future, and its health and productivity, is going to be resting in our hands. And so we have to have the tools and the political will to move forward. And that's what we're here to talk about today. What are those risks? What are those tools? And how can we move forward? So I appreciate the time. Thank you.
I've been almost as long in Louisiana now as I lived in Texas, which has given me a great opportunity to learn something about the middle of the Gulf of Mexico. besides my heritage in the western Gulf of Mexico, and to learn an awful lot about the coastal landscape there and the influence of the Mississippi River, which is a dominant feature in the north central part of the Gulf of Mexico and influences many other waters besides. So what I'm going to do is try to link the land to the sea in both directions, as you'll hear from me today. We've heard that the watershed for the for the Mississippi River into the Gulf of Mexico is huge. If we were to name the river over, as far as its farthest away reach, it would be called the Missouri River, because that's the longest distributary of the Mississippi. But we'll stick with Mississippi for this, whose headwaters are up here. Major sources of sediment from the west, mostly water from the east, and also water from the upper Mississippi. You can see that this light green is primarily agricultural land. Over 50% of the watershed is in agricultural production. And the rest is woodlands, ranges, wetlands, and some major metropolitan areas, but not any like you find on the east coast or the west coast. So that to understand nutrient pollution into receiving water, you also need to understand the sources. And this watershed is primarily agricultural, whereas Long Island Sound, that has similar problems with dead zones and harmful algal blooms, most of that water is from municipal wastewater and urban runoff. So that points to the very difference in these two. This system versus another is that the point source, the water that comes out at the end of a pipe, primarily, that can be regulated by the Clean Water Act, is only 10% of the input to this watershed, and the other 90% is non-point source. It comes from the atmosphere, which may have come from a smokestack or volatilization of manure, but it runs off of the water, off of the land, or falls out of the sky, and then eventually reaches the end of the Mississippi River, at which there has been, at least probably since the 1970s, a large area of low oxygen or hypoxia, often called the dead zone in the press. So this is one continuous ecosystem, but as Dr. McKinney mentioned, we also have a Gulf of Mexico large marine ecosystem, and the forces are just as prevalent from the ocean side onto the continental shelf of this area and well into the rest of the Gulf of Mexico as well. And in the middle of this intersection is where the Deepwater Horizon spill occurred 2 years ago in April. So I'm going to get back to the land, and I'm going to talk about the 90% of the nitrogen and phosphorus that comes from non-point sources in the watershed. And you can see that for nitrogen, corn and soybean rotation and other crops is way the majority of the source of nitrogen, and you can see where most of it comes from. And for phosphorus, again, high inputs from corn, soybean, and crops, but there's also a lot of natural erosion from pasture and rangeland as well. The phosphorus comes mostly over the land. The nitrogen comes mostly dissolved and works its way through tile drains, mostly in the Midwest, and then into rivers and groundwater. Hypoxia 101, hypo means low, oxia means oxygen, so you're low in oxygen, so you can't survive. Just think if you took a piece of saran wrap from Chicago to Des Moines and placed it over that large area and started sucking all the oxygen out, what would the organisms, including humans, cows, plants would be okay because they photosynthesize, what would happen to all those organisms? So the same thing happens in the Gulf, basically, because the Mississippi River brings fresh water, which creates a lens of less dense water over denser water, and that prevents oxygen from going to the surface to the bottom. At the same time, it brings in a lot of nutrients that fuel the phytoplankton. Just like you put fertilizer on a cornfield to get the corn to grow, all of this nitrogen and phosphorus causes the microorganisms, the phytoplankton, to grow, which feeds zooplankton and larger fish, but a lot of this material gets to the bottom, and when it's on the bottom, bacteria like you and I, that need oxygen, eat that carbon basically, and then generate carbon dioxide, and at the same time they use up the oxygen. So you have no resupply from the surface, and you have an active depletion of oxygen at the bottom, and you end up with low oxygen. So in the Gulf of Mexico, this occurs mostly in the area off of Louisiana, extending more and more into Texas. In the last couple of years, extending east of the Mississippi River as well. The source is the Mississippi River Birdfoot Delta, which delivers about a third of it. A third goes this way, and a third comes down the Atchafalaya. During the spring, when the river flow is the highest and the nutrients are the highest as well, the wind direction pushes most of it to the west. The flow goes down in the summer. There's less nutrients, but the winds start to push back from the south and from the west, and it holds all that fresh water, so you still have that two-layer system. So it's a two-layered system most of the year, except after storms, like hurricanes. And most of the activity that leads to the production of the carbon is in the spring. But that carbon is sufficient to carry over into the summer as well. Okay, so we end up having a large area of low oxygen on the Gulf of Mexico. Here it's depicted from, I think, 2008. And everything that's inside this line is less than 2, sometimes less than 1. And that's when the oxygen falls below 2, if a trawler puts a trawl over the side and drags it across the bottom, he won't catch any shrimp or fish. So that's our definition for low oxygen. You just basically, nothing lives there that can swim away when the oxygen falls below 2. Other organisms are affected at 3. Sharks' rays will move out a whole lot faster. The worms that live in the sediments can take a lot lower oxygen, but many of those often die off as well. And we have a loss of biodiversity. It can be up to 22,000 square kilometers, which is about the size of the state of Massachusetts. More frequently, the size of the state of New Jersey, which former EPA head Christine Todd Whitman did not like at all because she is a former governor of New Jersey, but it caught her attention. From very near shore to far offshore, from depths of about 4 meters or right up to the beach to about 40 meters deep offshore. It builds up in the spring. It's most severe in the summer. Hurricanes or cold fronts will start to break it down, and then it's usually not there in the winter, and the cycle starts all over again. And we have a lot of information from sediment cores that we take mostly from this area where the sediment accumulates over time, and you can date those sediments so that you know you have current sediments and historic sediments. And we can tell that there's more diatoms produced now than before. There's more carbon getting to the bottom now than before. And the organisms that can tolerate low oxygen are fewer now than they were historically. So this is not a natural occurrence in the Gulf. It's poised, but it's not natural. And the change came with landscape changes, primarily after World War II, as shown by this relationship. If you want to know how large the, quote, dead zone is in the Gulf of Mexico in the summer, all you need to know is the amount of nitrate load in the spring and a year term, and you can get about an 81% prediction for the size of the low oxygen. So nitrate is driving the system. Nitrate's increased, the load has increased 300% since the 1950s. Most of that is from increased concentration and some because of increased water. The amount of water is also important. The amount of phosphorus is also important. But the single variable that explains most of the size is the nitrate load. The nitrate load increased post-1950s, primarily through the application of artificial fertilizers. Tile drains are part of it. Confined animal feed operations are part of it. Atmospheric and municipal are there, but they're a minor component, less than 10%. So it's been a modified landscape plus additional human inputs of nutrients. Those nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, also create high productivity in the surface waters, which fuels the the food web, but some of those phytoplankton are not the ones that you would like to grow. They're harmful algal blooms, they're noxious, they can be toxic, they can cause fish kills, they can cause human health problems as well. This is an algal bloom after fresh water was diverted from the river to the east to try to keep oil out of the estuaries during the spill, and instead we got hypoxia and harmful algal blooms to the east of the river, more so than ever before. There are a lot of harmful algal blooms in the Gulf of Mexico. This is just a few of them. Some of them occur almost Gulf-wide, but not quite. Some of them are new appearances. Some of them are in the fresher waters. But all of these contain toxins and can harm human beings or the food that they consume, or also affect food webs. One of these, Pseudonychia pseudodelicatissima, as you can tell by this, very different color right here, has increased in frequency since the 1950s, consistent with the increase in the nitrate load. And this one is toxic. It has a poison called domoic acid that causes amnesic shellfish poisoning, which causes, God, I can't remember. No, which causes short-term memory loss, permanent short-term memory loss. It could be my age, or death, which is not something you would like. A recent paper in Nature Geosciences linked this poison with the behavior of birds that went crazy off California for Alfred Hitchcock's movie, but it also occurred naturally as well. The other feature of this river is it's built a huge deltaic plain that goes well into the Gulf of Mexico, which has changed over time. It's now a receding delta, and there are a lot of people that depend on it. One of the things that happened in the 30s is that oil and gas was discovered in the coastal wetlands, and then we moved offshore in the 1940s. And this is a typical bayou. This is Bayou Sally. This is natural. This is a channel that goes to a wellhead, and this is a channel that goes to a wellhead. And otherwise, you see a fairly intact marsh. But if you build more and more of those, and you confine water both inside or outside, you don't have the natural flow and you have erosion, you end up contributing to the major land loss issue in Louisiana. And these marshes are important as support for recruitment of organisms, for fisheries, recreational and commercial, and subsistence. There are subsistence fisheries in the northern Gulf of Mexico that have been affected by both the BP spill and hypoxia and loss of our coastal resources. And these are the socioeconomic factors that many people don't see when they see the news about the spill. So here are a few slides of the spill coming into coastal Louisiana. It was not produced by this oil well 20 miles offshore, but this is what it looked like when it was coming in. We were trying to collect it, but all you do is just get a glob of oil. This is what got into our wetlands, and if you go into the wetlands now, you can still find oil and still see the effects of oil on food webs and fishes and lots of other things. The Gulf of Mexico has been a great generator of oil and gas with these more inshore wells being pretty depleted right now, but we're going deeper and deeper, and we're getting more and more oil from these deep formations, and this is likely to be our future for quite some time, including other areas of the world. Brazil, Cuba, Mexico. In our Gulf of Mexico large marine ecosystem. So we have a river that's built a huge delta. It's led to many of the oil deposits that we have on the bottom. It covers the entire United States almost. So we have a huge ecosystem that ranges from the Midwest out into the deep Gulf of Mexico with many interacting multiple stressors and dynamics. All of this is going to be put in the context of an increased population. We're doing more and more corn for ethanol for biofuels. Agribusiness is the business now, not small mom and pop farms. More fossil fuel use and atmospheric deposition, more and more people moving to the coast and squeezing our natural habitats, and of course our energy needs are going to go up in the future. So we want to try to keep all of this context in our heads as we move forward to try to manage our resources in a wise way. Thank you.
So I'm going to start out with a Hydrology 101, and as a background of the talk, which is using tools to get a better understanding of sources of nutrients and organic matter in the Mississippi and Gulf of Mexico. And I was hired by the USGS 32 years ago to set up a nitrate isotope capability and use these tools to work on problems where environments that had very high nitrate concentrations, to better understand where the nitrate was coming from and the processes in the environment that might remediate the nitrate. And most of the nitrate that's applied on the surface, a large percent of it runs off the surface into the stream, so I very early on got interested in how do streams work. And that's where this cartoon comes along, is my puzzle at how little we actually knew about how streams worked. And if you're trying to understand how nitrate gets in the stream and then works down the system, that was a problem. So let's talk a little bit how streams work. This is a hydrograph. It has discharge, water flow on one axis, and time on the x. There are no units because it could be any size of a storm event. And what you do when you try to figure out what's the source of water in the stream is you go out and you collect water samples and you analyze them for chloride or isotopes or whatever you want to try to figure out how much of that hydrograph is the water coming from brand new rain versus how much of it is coming from groundwater. In most of the cases, you get the following: is that during the storm event there is a small amount of water that's rain, and a large part of the water in the river is actually coming from groundwater. And I remember being so surprised about this, because if you go ask anybody, why would anybody be surprised? You go out, it's raining, and the stream water is rising. You go, where's the water coming from? Like, duh, it's coming from the rain. But some very large percent of the time, it really isn't. And this is a very fundamental puzzle. Struck me early on in my career, is something as simple as how streams work. We didn't really know. We thought we knew. We published many papers thinking we knew. But lots of puzzles here. But if you go to some other stream and you sample and try to figure out the proportions, sometimes you find the opposite, is that a large part of it is new water and a small part is groundwater. So you can imagine if you had a feedlot, a farm with two different land uses that one had lots of new water in the stream and one had small amount, it would have a very different hydrologic response, and the nitrate would go different places. So this was an important part of understanding how the nitrate system works, is how does the stream hydrology work? So besides simple things like what is the main source of water in the stream, how does the nitrate get into the water, into the stream? Some of it comes in from runoff, some of it comes in from groundwater. And in an environment, show a little cartoon here, this is a typical watershed. There are a variety of patches of land use. There are point sources, there are non-point sources, and all of these different little parts of the watershed contribute nitrate to the stream. Some of them it's mostly runoff, meaning the water runs off the surface. Some of them it's mostly infiltration to groundwater. Each of these ends up with different sources of nitrate moving into the groundwater and surface water in a very different way. And if you're going to try to say what of these different land uses is contributing the most nitrate to the river, this is not simple. It's not as simple as knowing where the water comes from. You need to know the soils, the water, the depth of the water table, the different kinds of land uses. A large city here could have a lot larger contribution of nitrate than an area here of row crops that has a whole lot more fertilizer in it, but this nitrate may get directly into the river, whereas that nitrate may get a chance to get remediated going through a wetland or something. So it all gets to be very, very complicated. And for things like if you're trying to decide, okay, I'm trying to reduce the nitrate in this river, what remediation policy do I implement first? And it's not as simple as going, well, this amount of bags of fertilizer applied here, this is the number of people here, let's calculate how much and decide which one is a bigger problem, because, as I said, the row crop fertilizer might not make it to the stream much at all. It might not make it for 30 years, whereas this water from they could have sewer lines that leak, they could have a non-enhanced wastewater treatment system, lots of complications here. So, if you're trying to decide what to do about nitrate pollution, how do you deal with the uncertainty of all of these different things going on? And what you do is you have tools, and that's where this whole thing comes in, is different tools. And I'm going to talk about two different kinds of tools, research tools to investigate how water, nutrients, and organics get into the river and on their way to the Gulf. So this is my punchline slide, which I put in once, so I can say it again at the end, is why do we need new tools for water resources management? And the first and obvious one is it tells us things that we didn't know before. But I have discovered that the really important one is that it tells us things that we were sure we knew before and we're just absolutely wrong. And that has been my whole career using a tool that had not been very well utilized, is how many times we find out that things that we grew up in and read papers on just aren't exactly how the system works. And I think that's the real power of a new tool, is the chances of finding out the whole world isn't the way we thought it was. And I'm not just saying this is something that only isotopes do. This any new tool coming in that has not been part of the model formulation has a chance of showing you things are different. And of course, the obvious one is if you actually know what the real problem is and know how the system works, you can do a much better job of solving it. Whereas if you target your money on the wrong problem, you're probably going to waste a lot of taxpayers' money. Bad. So that's the punchline. A good tool is something which you use it to evolve your understanding of a system. Those data are applied into models. The models are used. They're tested. You add new data to it. It's a continuous process here. And I'm going to talk about a USGS model, Sparrow, which has been worked on for 10, 15 years now, and it's been continuously improved with new data, and it's become a very powerful tool for testing out various scenarios of how local people might consider what is their major problem and how they might remediate it. And using isotopes along with the models are very complementary tools. Each one leads to testable hypotheses for the next one. So, Sparrow Model. This is, and Sparrow, it's all capitalized. It's an acronym, and it's a cute acronym. So one of the uses of Sparrow is to predict the relative amounts of different sources of nitrogen to streams. And this is one I kind of like that Bill Alexander put together, where you plot what parts of the country is the main source of N nitrogen from fertilizer. So if it's red, it's 50 to 100%. So you see in the Midwest, no surprise here. Lots of the nitrogen is from fertilizer. Other places in the Northeast, where there's a lot of N from coal-fired power plants in the atmosphere, the amount of the atmospheric deposition is an important part. So that's kind of how those graphs work. And I'll give a little example of in Illinois, most of the N is from nitrogen to fertilizer, and it's in red, so let's skip on by. Okay, you've seen these pie diagrams from Nancy's talk. And one of the uses of Sparrow is to calculate the relative amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus and also carbon and sediments to different sources, from different sources to the mouth of the Mississippi going into the Gulf. And that's what these diagrams are. So this here is saying that 37% of the phosphorus, the P, is coming from pasture and rangelands. And this is animal agriculture, basically. That's the largest source of phosphorus. For N, for nitrogen, as Nancy said, the largest part is from the crop soybean rotation. But suppose you wanted to know what are the sources of nitrogen and phosphorus to some smaller watershed somewhere up higher in the system. You can use the same model for this and calculate for any point you want based on all available data put into the Sparrow model and their very best ability to test the model and refine it to incorporate our best understanding of how the system works. You can calculate this out and say, in this part of the system, my gosh, maybe the main source is an atmospheric deposition. Then you would target your remediation plans on something focused on that. Okay, so how can Sparrow model predictions be tested? And I'm, of course, going to propose using isotopes. And the idea is we use the isotopes to test a prediction of the model. We come up with our idea, they come back with their model and refute something that we thought we understood, and this goes back and forth. Thank you. So isotopes, how to use isotopes to fingerprint different nitrogen sources. And so you have manure, you have fertilizer, you have humans and septic fields. And just like the TV series CSI, you can use isotopes to fingerprint all of the different potential suspects in the environment. But the the nitrogen sources, but unlike CSI, the suspects don't always have distinguishable isotopic values. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. You have to test for sure. From my experience, it works so often that your best bet is to assume it probably is going to go work and try it out. And where there are distinctive differences, then you can go out to your field site, you can collect water samples, take them back to the lab, analyze them, come up with a prediction about sources, which then you put in the literature for somebody to refute with a new set of data. That's how science advances. So what are isotopes? There are two geeky slides. I apologize. I can't avoid some technical language here, but you've all heard of carbon-14. It's the isotope everybody hears about. I'm not talking about carbon-14. These are not radioisotopes. I'm talking about stable isotopes. So carbon-13, carbon-12 are two stable isotopes. N15, N14 are two stable isotopes. We're looking at the ratios of isotopes in water samples. And this is a bunch of little pie diagrams again, showing that most of the isotope is in the blue color, and so 90% is carbon-12. The little teeny bit there is the carbon-13. We're measuring the ratios of the little teeny to the real big, and I'm going to call those, for simplicity, isotope values. That gets away from a lot of geeky terminology. So isotope values. So what I've done in these next plots is take these pie diagrams from the USGS NACWA Sparrow modeling team and go look up what the kind of average nitrogen isotope value for that source. This is so here's the row crop. If that was the dominant source of nitrate to an environment and it was not subject to a lot of biological fractionation, then these are the compositions you would get, the isotope ratios. And what you can see is animal agriculture has a high value compared to row crop sorts of things, and so does human waste. And this is the main use of the nitrogen isotopes, is human and animal waste versus all the other ones. It's an extremely powerful tool. It's been used for 40 years, and it works so often that it's provides my funding. You can also do analyzing phosphate for oxygen isotopes. Phosphorus has only one stable isotope, so you're kind of out of luck doing a ratio of isotopes, but it has oxygen. So we've analyzed oxygen isotope values of phosphate as sources. And again, the human waste has a very distinctive isotope value compared to other sources, meaning a potentially useful tracer of that source in an environment where people are arguing about which is the dominant source. Sparrow also has a carbon model, and for determining the amount of organic matter in rivers. And actually, we have tested this assertion of Sparrow. We have pre-tested it 15 years ago with an analysis of organic matter from the Mississippi River, where we concluded, very controversially at the time, everybody knew that it wasn't mostly algae, but their isotope data showed it was mostly algae. The model here concluded it's more than half algae is the organic matter, and our isotope data had concluded the same thing. This is one of my favorite examples of people who think they know something and they're just wrong. Is a whole generations of ecologists have said these big rivers are too turbid to support primary growth of algae. They just flat out were wrong. It didn't take very much sampling to go out and find out this was true. And the model came up with the same idea. And I just think this is something we get used to, is so many things that we think are true turn out to be, much more complicated. And that's what new tools tell you, is that things don't work the way you had thought, and advances science, and it's a wonderful field to be in. So back to where I started from, value of continuously developing and applying new tools for water resources management to tell you things that you didn't know. More importantly, and good clean fun for isotope geochemists, is to contradict things that you thought you knew. And it's just really good clean fun to be able to come in and say, hey, I didn't know how the system worked. I went out, I collected samples, I let the values tell me what's going on, and continued. It's a great field. And again, if you get the sources right, you're more likely to be able to solve the problems. So not only do we need new tools, continuously applied, working back and forth with our model development, we need more data. Once upon a time, when I started working, piggybacking on the USGS NASQUA network, it's our big river monitoring program, all of these blue dots here, there were 400 of them back when we started this. This is the network now, except for one site in Alaska I left off. 30-odd compared to 400. These are the places where we are getting hydrology and geochemistry data to keep our models up to date. And we're hoping that as the Secure Water Act is fully implemented, we will up the number of places again where we're gathering data. Thank you very much.
I would like you to join me in thanking our three speakers for a very illuminating walk through this set of problems.
I'm Dr. Larry McKinney. I'm the Executive Director of the Harte Research Institute for Gulf of Mexico Studies at Texas A&M in Corpus Christi, Texas. What happens in the Gulf and what happens upstream of the Gulf affects us directly. But what people don't understand is that even if you live anywhere in the country, you have a stake of what goes on in the Gulf of Mexico and its health, because you eat its seafood, you enjoy its products, those types of things. There's a direct connection. The key to the future of the Gulf of Mexico is resilience. Its ability to bounce back from oil spills or any kind of even natural perturbations like hurricanes. So that resilience depends on a healthy environment. That means habitat that's there to support the fish and the wildlife, habitat that's there to provide the ecological services, ecosystem services that we depend on to prevent flooding and to treat our water. Well, the Gulf is amazingly resilient. It keeps coming back no matter how often we hit it, and that's the danger, because we'll think it go on forever. We know from examples around the world, like the Aral Sea, the Caspian Sea, even in our own country, the Florida Everglades or the Colorado on the West Coast, that if you neglect the system, it can collapse, and the consequences in public health and economics are severe. Well, the Gulf is the 9th largest body of the world, and we have issues in every part of the Gulf of Mexico, not only in the U.S. but Mexico as well. So it's a large marine ecosystem, and the problems are on that scale.
I'm Nancy Rabelais. I'm the Executive Director of Louisiana University's Marine Consortium, and I'm also a research professor there. I came to talk about the linkages of the Mississippi River with the Gulf of Mexico, from the land to the sea and from the sea towards the land, and some of the water quality problems that we have, some of the coastal landscape changes that we've experienced, and a little bit about the BP oil spill. In the area around the Mississippi Delta and adjacent to it, there's been a long history of coastal land loss. There's been a long history of hazards from hurricanes. There's been changes in fisheries resources. There's been a bad economy. And then there's also been the BP oil spill. So it's hard. The troops are feeling a little beaten down right now because and they feel a lot of uncertainty after the oil spill, because they don't think they're getting clear information or data to help them understand what's going on. So the issue of excess nutrients, nitrogen and phosphorus, it's a major issue in the northern Gulf of Mexico, because we have the second largest human-caused dead zone in the world. There are smaller ones in the estuaries. There's a large one in Chesapeake Bay, Long Island Sound, the New York Bight, the Puget Sound is starting to have problems now. The Washington coast is having a similar problem. Theirs is more related to changing currents and changing winds and possibly climate change. So that's just in the U.S., and there's over 500 such low oxygen areas around the globe, and they've been increasing exponentially. And they used to be mostly in the developed countries, Western Europe and the United States, and but they're spreading more and more to areas around Asia, China, Southeast Asia, South America, where they're basically catching up with our technology and high levels of fertilizer use and just different ways of life and industrialization. Well, I think at least the United States could take some lessons from the European Union, who've developed something called the Helsinki Convention on nutrient pollution and making specific regulations for reducing nitrogen and phosphorus into the environment. I think educating people more about their carbon footprint, because a lot of the use of carbon ends up also being excess use of nitrogen and phosphorus as well. And I think I would advocate for using the Clean Water Act capabilities more for addressing non-point source pollution. The economics that drive the situation is the biggest challenge because of global markets and ways of life, but there's also the need for social and political will as well. Socially, I think many farmers are becoming more aware of the issue, and many are taking steps in the right direction to try to curb their fertilizer use or have a more sustainable farm. But the fact is that most of the agriculture in the U.S. and many areas around the world now is big agribusiness. It's driven by industry. There's quite a bit of work that's been done on exactly what kind of remediation can remove the most nitrogen per acre per year. And there are costs to those remediation efforts. So there's a good balance between what we know it can be most effective to reducing the nitrate loads, and we also know the costs of those efforts. So we need to put those two together to be the most efficient at how we can reduce the nitrogen. Some things aren't going to work. In the Mississippi River watershed, very little comes from urban wastewater. And to put tertiary treatment on some of these water plants costs a lot of money, and you don't get that much return, reduced nitrogen, for the amount of money that you have to spend to get there. One thing that's not apparent is that the results of the pollution are so far away from the source that it's hard for people to understand that their actions at the head of the watershed are affecting the Gulf of Mexico. But there are also water quality problems in the watershed. There are toxic blue-green algal blooms, there's nasty swimming water, there's dead fish, and I think if those issues were addressed in their local water quality problems, it would benefit both them and the Gulf of Mexico.
I am Kendall. I am a research hydrologist at the U.S. Geological Survey in Menlo Park, California. These models that have been developed with large sets of data and all the understanding that the modelers can put into it, it's based on a relatively small number of sites, and people are making calculations at all sorts of scales. And I think the ability to test these scenarios is important. You can use the models to come up with scenarios that make sense with all available knowledge, but some of them, before the investments are made, I think we should think about what other tools, what other measurements we could go in to make absolutely sure that the money will be well spent. There are lots of tools one could use. With the Valdez oil spill, there was a lot of question about what organics washing up on the coasts of different places were actually from the Valdez. That could be done in the Gulf of Mexico also, making sure that we're actually, we know which the oil spills and little leaks from wells happen all along coastal areas. So those are tools that can be used. Understanding the whole hypoxic process and the whole decay of organic matter, there are tools to better understand what actual processes are going on. What organic matter is being decayed, how much of it is in situ productivity in the Gulf because of the too much nitrate in the Mississippi versus algae formed in the river itself and washed into the Gulf and then decayed. If it turns out that organic matter is a significant contributor to hypoxia, we should pay more attention to it. Half the organic matter coming down the Mississippi is bioavailable and moving into the Gulf will consume oxygen just like new algae. I think you use your models to come up with your best available scientific information of what the problem is, and then I would think convening a group of people to think about playing devil's advocate on this. What would be a real rigorous test of that model that, when it's proved or disproved, will get the community behind it. One of the other tools that's I think really important for these kinds of applications are the continuous monitoring sensors, the optical sensors that can measure nitrate and nutrients and organics and all sorts of things that can be deployed and left there for weeks at a time without monitoring. That I see this as part of the future, where it's very expensive to send a person out to collect a water sample, but you could set these instruments there making these measurements when people are busy and shouldn't be out in a hazardous environment. And I think that's the future, is having these continuous monitoring systems deployed in our rivers. There is a huge project in the USGS trying these out in several major watersheds, including in the Mississippi. And they're measuring continuous nitrate, showing all little variations of nitrate, meaning there's something going on in the river that we didn't know was going on. That's fascinating. They are validating the fact that the organic matter is such a large percent of it is formed in the river and bioavailable. And these are things which we had not had good data about. I think this is an exciting field, and people can use them to calculate percents from different sources by measuring the kind of fingerprints of these things in chemical space. I think it's a very powerful tool.